the Community Resource Board is essentially the group that would manage the internal resources available to Martians. So of the production within the colony, there's a certain amount that would be necessary to distribute to individual colonists in order to provide their subsistence needs. But the idea would not be to operate close to that production capacity. We would want a significant excess in order to stabilize the colony against any variability in that production, and also to export these resources to other local colonists or back to Earth. Now, that buffer quantity would in and of itself include a portion that is dedicated back to the colony itself. So not for export to Earth, not for sale to other Martian installations, but specifically dedicated to the colonists of the Bubble Act. And this is all in part to promote a local economy. So some of these resources would be publicly accessible through the Community Resource Board, but you can think of the system more as you having a certain amount of buying power that you can then access this local market and participate in that exchange. So this is, of course, a controlled market in the sense that individuals will not be able to purchase more than a specific quantity of these available goods, and overall, the long-term accumulation of these goods will be regulated in and of itself. So this is intended to model the Meshev model. So if anyone is familiar with a kibbutz, which is essentially a communal living situation, a Meshev is a very interesting variation of that, where there is the ability to have private property while also maintaining access to a lot of publicly shared resources. This is something that some city dwellers might be experienced with as well. So in Philadelphia, we have a communal tool library that I would say is a great example of what this would be. And there are a few other ways that will promote this system as well, which is using a local currency. So this is to prevent the exchange, or to prevent the trend of value from drifting back towards wealthy individuals on Earth who might be accessing the interior Martian market through individuals on Mars or digitally. And so this would be outside of the administrative board. It would be hard to regulate those sort of transactions digitally, at least, but through the use of a local currency, we can ensure that some value stays in the Martian economy. Okay. And so just to end here with a touch on some of the commercially available goods and services that we're going to have, you can essentially think of this as an enhanced version of what you would find at a local farmer's market or within a small town for domestically produced goods. So beyond that, we would be looking at some IP being produced of high export value, but we'd be mostly looking at small luxury goods. So agricultural products like cannabis and wine that have a very high value per weight, as well as fashion products that would, again, be a very luxury good, would be what we'd primarily be looking at for export to Mars. All right. And so I just want to leave things off there and leave a bit of time for questions, and just end that with a idea that the Bubble Act is intended to be a springboard. It's a starting point for the greater colonization of Mars, and I think that it needs to be looked at that way, in that it's just a snapshot in time that is going to be an important reflection point when we really consider the grander scale of what the Martian civilization will become. All right, I'm going to stop my share here and turn it back over to questions. Okay, so I had admin and definitely had people that I did not see had the admit request.
Darn. Yeah, I was afraid of that. Because Mike, anyway, we can talk about it later.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it's a technical difficulty. Mike was there too. And I was like, oh, maybe when I handed it over to Stelly, he got all the admin. I don't know how to fix that. So we'll figure it out for next time. So everybody who missed this, who see later in the recordings, our apologies. We'll get that worked out. Also, Dr. Mike, our bad. We'll get you on next time, buddy. Yeah, Stilly, thank you very much for that. That was great. I got a chance to really see that for a second time, and it was good to have an opportunity. You had, what, 25 minutes, half an hour the first time? when we were in LA here last year, and really it felt like you had an opportunity to really kind of flesh the whole thing out, the entire Bobolac idea. One question that I've got is, so moving forward, knowing Bobolac, now both Dan and I have had an opportunity to look at that a little bit more in depth. What are some of the things that you'd like to see Settling Space add as far as some design specs? And what are some things that you'll take from the Bobolac right now, and then moving forward and integrate that into as the tent becomes larger and the think tank becomes larger and more broad in our diversity? What are some of the things that you'd like to see definitely adapted moving forward? What the real kind of practical things, and what's maybe kind of more of the moon Mars shot stuff?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I feel like a lot of what I see Settling Space getting involved with is the elements that I see being developed more globally across the space colonization infrastructure over the next few years. So specifically, one of the weak points in that infrastructure right now is a lot of the life support and habitation systems. They're very basic right now, and they're not really geared towards long-term independent, robust operations. So they frequently have media changes that require, exogenous processing. So you're going to have to replace a canister at some point. They typically require refined parts that might not necessarily be available on Mars, and it's something that I would like to see us really focus on. So systems that are able to be cleaned in a way that is less media intensive, in such a way that they could be essentially reset to their initial starting point, or really developed in a way to avoid that need for a disposable element overall. But beyond that, a lot of so I'm definitely privy to a lot more of what Settling Space is working on than everyone else, but I would love to see a lot of the things that we're focused on in terms of materials really step into the forefront. So materials specifically in bio-derived elements, but also in terms of materials that are more suitable towards the infrastructural processing needs that we'll really look at on Mars. So I say this somewhat in the sense of organically derived acids that are naturally derived acids that might be more suitable towards some of the processes that we're looking at, or specific materials that are more bacterially resistant, so surface coatings and that sort of thing that will ensure the robust stability on Mars. Sure.
I was curious about, the diet. It's pretty similar to what we had on Earth. And I didn't know if, constraint-wise about growing food on Mars, you had looked into something like insect farming or algae farming, which might have lower constraints, though it is, less familiar now.
Yeah, so it's definitely something I looked into, and it's definitely something that is built into the infrastructure of the colony. So you'll note that we have bioproduction tanks for healthcare needs. So we have the ability to produce, antibiotics. We have the ability to produce bacteriophages. We have the ability to produce other, biologically derived recombinant proteins that we might need for just supplementing the individual on Mars. But those systems could be altered or expanded to focus on, say, nutritional yeast, say spirulina as a dietary additive or something along those lines. But one of the bigger concerns there is that you still need everyone to enjoy the food. So this has to be something that people eat every day. And one of the biggest issues that they have with astronauts now is that they don't consume their full allotment of calories that they've been given every day, to the point where it's a concern amongst the astronaut groupings that what can we do to enhance the enjoyment and uptake of food in space environments. And so the dust environment of Mars is something that's considered to be a hazard towards that as well, and could potentially impact the astronaut's sense of smell and further interfere with the food interaction. But more broadly, it's about people being comfortable with their foods. So while a paradigm shift is something that this colony design could handle, it's not something I want to force on people for living in order to live in the colony.
That's fair. Thanks.
Yeah.
Stelly, what are some of the applications and the technologies there? Maybe how do we do this on the moon? It's a lot closer. What would you change about, say, like I know on the moon, it's a very abrasive environment. Would you see a need for a lot of changes, or do you think this is a model that would be pretty easily adapted to, say, even zero G? Maybe what do they call that? Astronium or Asgardia. That's what it was. Something like
Yes.
Asgardia. Well, is that something that you see as an easy model to move backwards and forwards, or is it more on a place by place?
Well, so two parts there. The one thing about this design is applicable for the moon. So the moon, my friend here. So on the moon, this design would be something that would be more likely to be centered in a lava tube. So as I mentioned, the low bait debris apron is sort of central to this design. You're tunneling into this looser, sandier material and excavating a large cavern to be your living area. So that's nice because you're sealing the inside of it with an air-create thermal layer anyway, which is something you would want to do in a lava tube either on the moon or Mars. But on the moon, you're not going to really see this low bait debris apron, or at least in the sense of the characteristics that you'd be benefiting most from on Mars, specifically the ice within it. It's very likely to have much lower ice content. You're not going to see this mesa feature, which, though the debris apron is still maintained in such a large volume because of the limited amount of erosion on Mars, you need a certain amount of erosion in order to generate the apron itself. A big part of the reason that there is anticipated to be a glacier there is because of the overburden of rocky regolith on top of that that's securing that glacier in place. But that glacier initially formed when there was a much higher water content on Mars. On the moon, you would have never had that initially high water content to really generate the glacier in the first place, and you wouldn't see the phase transition of you wouldn't see the regolith really piling on top of it. You wouldn't really have the situations that then removed a lot of the surface water from other areas of Mars. So it would just be it'd be more of a direct water or direct lava tube settlement there. But a lot of the infrastructural demands in terms of power, processing systems are going to be pretty similar in that you would still want a very robust chemical industry. You would still want a much higher use of automation and remotely controlled drone systems. But the healthcare industry is one where you would not need to rely nearly as heavily on internally produced products. So you could get away with a quarter of the medical staff, and that's just a guess there, in terms of the capacity to really deal with any more, larger incidents that you might need to have more medical staff available for. You also would not suffer nearly as much from the shelf stability issues that plague a lot of the medical industry right now. So your emergency crash kits and stuff could be restocked from Earth without the need to produce virtually any of that in situ. And hello to our new joiner, Cyborg, as well. Sorry we had some issues with entry to the event earlier, but do let us know if you have any questions. We'll just be taking questions more generally on Martian colonization and technical concerns related to that.
Okay, thanks. I'm just taking it in. I joined late. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Thanks for joining us, though. We'll get things. This is being recorded. This will be going on to settlingspace.com, our webpage. As right now, there's a parking page, but that'll be going on later, hopefully within about the next week or so. And then it'll also be shared through social media, Facebook and Twitter, for the links as well. So thank you for being with us. If you got here, you'll see the link again.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. So I just want to point out a few other things. So with that, a great point to get in touch with us again is going to be our next event, which is going to be the kickoff meeting for the local chapter of the Mars Society. So this will be on September 8th at 7. But one of the best ways to follow updates before that event is going to be our Facebook group, which is the Mars Society Philadelphia. And we're also on Twitter at Settling Space. All right. So any last questions before we wrap up here for the evening?
On the note of external support, since you were doing your plugs just then anyways,
Yeah.
Besides a university that would be sending up researchers, what sort of support would you expect for the Blue Black, would you expect global support or a specific nation or like a group of nations or even specific industries?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I go into this a bit more in the paper, but there's a lot that's in flux about that question that I would say is hard to really nail down until you start seeing people begin this sort of development. So part of the reason I centered this design around a university is for a colony to begin, you would expect there to be some sort of catalyst towards that greater thing. And so the establishment of a university is one potential such catalyst, in the sense of it being for exploring and characterizing and delving into the questions on the surface of Mars. So looking at it from that angle, you're saying that likely there would be a group of interested parties on the Earth that would essentially establish an endowment towards the perpetuation of this university. And that, as one body, though, would be separate from other dedicated interests that might be interested in a more commercial aspect of the development of Mars. So specifically the nuclear systems and a lot of the more fundamental infrastructure, I would expect to be some of the early movers on this front. So if you look at someone like NuScale, who has developed a small modular reactor, on Earth, they have a significant market for that, but space is somewhere where you would see a more obligatory need for technology like that. So it's hard to really source the power density that you're looking for on a remote body like Mars outside of nuclear power. There are ways to get into this with solar, and within the Black colony, which I didn't really get into today, it's expected that you'd have up to between 1/2 kilometer and 1 full kilometer of solar panels to the tune of 30 to 50 megawatts of solar power being produced. But that's a much smaller amount than the 350 megawatts of nuclear power that you'd be looking at. But all of this is just to say that for someone like NuScale, looking at the cost of, essentially a sweetheart loan towards a colony for these nuclear systems as both a way of gaining market share for the greater Martian power network, and also for promoting their usage in, say, an L5 society, say a moon colony, other things that will be relevant factors within that market, it could be a worthwhile investment to them. Other companies that you might look at for this are Siemens, which would be involved in the more just technical capability side of things. So Lindgas, a number of pharmaceutical companies might be interested in just the data alone. And so one thing to look at more broadly on the economics of this is we would be expecting this to be a somewhat affluent society. So because of the need for individuals to really contribute to the Martian economy and also produce a significant amount of taxable revenue, we'd be looking at more of a target GDP per capita of $300,000. So this is much more in the sense of high-value legal services. It's assuming that most members of the Martian civilization would be involved in clinical trials to the benefit of roughly $10,000 per individual. So per individual, we can expect a financial contribution per individual involved in a clinical trial. We can expect a financial contribution to the greater Martian economy of between $10,000 and $20,000. So that, as a greater initiating financial system, might be something that is quite significant.
Excellent. Well thought.
Yeah. So, and kind of just to expand on that a little bit more too, there is a lot of, and this is speculation at this point, I'm going to say, interest in using a secured debt model as a way of using the known growth potential of a Martian colony to really leverage any initial capital that you come across. So this is the mechanism that was used in the housing market, credit default swaps, where you essentially insure certain debt for the Martian colony as a way of expanding your lendable capital. But as with the housing market, this is a somewhat risky situation, so you have to tie it to industries that have a dedicated capacity for growth, so industrial resource extraction or something a bit more tangible. All right. So unless you guys have any other questions, I think we might wrap it there for the evening.
My brain is full, man. I'm glad you're at the head of the helm, especially considering because you brought up some very good points. And William, thank you for also asking about the financing models, because how do we take it to the next level? And knowing that there are plans, knowing that there are methodologies that aren't just Bitcoin's going to be awesome. Actual true Buffett style steps that we could take to finance and fund what is. I don't even hesitate. I don't even want to think about how much it's actually going to cost, because if you think about it, it'll never get started. That's one of those things. You just got to make that first step.
Well, yes, and just one final note to wrap up is I would not expect it to be entirely divorced from the Earth economy. The American colonies never were financially separated from the European interests. They just developed their own interests over time.
That's the point. Yeah. So at some point, you just gotta break the tethers. That's the point.
Right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Stelly, thank you for presenting. Really, it was great to be able to finally get a chance to really kind of hear the extended version, and I'm going to go over it all again to try to, there's a lot in there. Look forward to being able to do the editing and really give it a good solid listen through another time, and then you and I can have some more conversations as things go. And once again, just a quick reminder to everybody, the Mars Society of Philadelphia, which we're all members, and hopefully you can join us, everybody else who's still online. That's going to be our first meeting inaugural is going to be September 8th at 7 o'clock. And we will be sending out the links as well through, you'll probably get a MailChimp blast from us, and also through Facebook and Twitter. Also, please check out settlingspace.com, net.org, and info, maybe even space. We locked them all down just because. Yeah, thank you. That's all I had.
All right. And so I'm going to end. All right, everyone, you have a great night.